Well, hi again, wherever you happen to be. This is Michael Hingson, and you are listening to Unstoppable Mindset. And today we get to meet Peter Garcia, or would you rather go by Peter Bloch Garcia?
It's Peter Bloch Garcia.
Peter Bloch Garcia. All right. And Peter grew up in Yakima, Washington, and has spent most of his life in, I guess, the Northwest. Has been an educator and a foundation person who's been responsible for a number of things, and he'll talk to us about that, and definitely an advocate. And among other things, Peter has spent a lot of time dealing with education and quality of access for low income and BIPOC people. And I asked Peter, and I'm going to ask you again, what is BIPOC? Because I think probably a lot of us haven't heard of it. At least I hope I'm not the only one.
Yeah, happy to. And no, I don't believe you are the only one because it's a relatively new term that's emerged in the last few years. It's actually an acronym that stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And it's being used more as an inclusive way, but also to amplify the significance of and importance of addressing racism by calling out and emphasizing the importance of Black and Indigenous aspects of that, of people of color.
Got it. We have acronyms for everything nowadays, don't we?
Yes. It is being used more as a common noun, though. Yeah.
And that's fair. But we do like to describe everything. Well, tell me a little bit about you growing up and kind of how you got to where you are.
Well, basically my story is, so my mom is an immigrant from Mexico, and I was born here in the United States after she came to the US, and she came without speaking English, but learned it fairly quickly. And how that sort of has shaped me, we grew up with, as we got older, me and my siblings had very typical or stereotypical even challenges and situations that are typical of folks of color in this country and in society from a background like that. At the time, Yakima was it was very much of a migrant farming community. And growing up there, I was really not very happy growing up there for a variety of reasons, both the typical traumas and issues within our family, as well as the extended community that was not very inclusive. And but I didn't have the language. I didn't really understand why or what was happening. But what I think was really important to me that shaped me who I am today was that I had some adults in my life who were very influential. One was I was in a youth employment and training program for low-income kids that was federally funded back in the day. And my case manager, her name's Ajua N. Karuka, she saw more in me than I saw in myself. But also, as an African-American woman, she was starting to talk to me. That's where I think I started getting some of the language to understand issues around race. But it wasn't until I went to college where I also got active on campus. Back then, in mid 80s, race in this country was seen as something that we had already dealt with in the past. Oh, that was something in the 60s. In fact, all kids of color pretty much were seen on campus as taking somebody else's seat, taking a white student's seat, or that we got into the school because we weren't qualified, but it was a affirmative action thing that we didn't really belong, all of that stuff. And so I spent in my spare time as an undergraduate, as a student activist, and try to work on improving things, recruiting more students of color, supporting the students of color, improving our graduation rates and things such as that. And then I went into teaching after that, partly because I felt so privileged from my kind of background to have gotten a college education. Some of my siblings didn't graduate high school. And yet here I was going through college, and I wanted to give back. So I first started going into education because I wanted to share the kind of education that I felt privileged by with other kids like me. So I started going into teaching, and I taught for a number of years. I taught in different countries, Mexico and Italy. I taught for a short time in New York City, but I left teaching eventually, and I ended up working in nonprofits. And that's where you mentioned the foundation work, which was purely coincidental because I didn't know there was a sector on giving money away, philanthropy, right? But I landed at a foundation.
What kind of places did you teach? High school, college, or what?
I taught mostly secondary levels, so
Okay.
High school, and more of the years was spent in middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grades, some 9th, 10th, and a few junior level classes.
You said something.
Yeah. Go ahead. I was just going to say, I was an English teacher mostly, but I taught a little bit of social studies as well.
Which kind of relates.
Oh.
Well, you said something really interesting, which I've thought about a lot. I know it's true, but you said that people probably in the 80s sort of thought, well, race is all taken care of. It was all dealt with in the 60s and 70s. But the view generally was that people of different races were taking seats from white people.
Yeah.
And I think actually there's still a lot of people who think that way today, but nevertheless, that doesn't sound like it was really dealing with race, of course, does it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is still definitely a part of the frame, especially with our immigration policy. For the last 30 some years, it's been, we got to control immigration because they're taking our jobs kind of thing. But I think to your question, it still was rooted in racism from my perspective. But it was sort of an excuse, like, of no, we don't have to deal with racism because it was done before, and no sort of self-awareness of the privilege. In fact, there was this one class I was taking in college. It was an ethnic studies, political science kind of class. And the professor threw out this term of reverse discrimination in a lecture once. And in my study group with friends, they mentioned something about reverse discrimination. And I said, but that's not what he meant. But at that time, in that period of time, there was this belief that reverse discrimination was rampant all over the country. And that's where, it's reverse discrimination because folks of color, students of color are taking the seats of white students, then they're not qualified to be here kind of thing. So it was about race and racial bias, but also the system at the time itself was not doing a good job of encouraging more kids of color to go to college.
What do you think about this whole concept of they're taking our jobs? And today we're talking about immigration and, we're letting them in our country and they're taking our jobs.
Well, I mean, there's been plenty of research that's been done on that to show, how that's not true, and the type of workers, and partly like there's more experts in that research field that have disproven that over time and again. And there's even other research that talks about how countries with thriving economies, they are thriving economies because they have a growing immigrant population all the time. They continue. It's like you're adding to the workforce and that sort of thing. So there's plenty of other evidence to counter it, but yeah.
Nevertheless, it gets promoted.
It does. It is, and it's a political wedge. It's promoted as a political wedge.
Right. And I'm still looking for the jobs that they are taking, because most of the time when I hear about that, I'm sort of looking at people that I know, and I know a number of people who have come from other countries, and mostly I haven't seen people who live here, and I guess if we say white people or whatever, or people who come from here, necessarily even wanting to work in those jobs, which is a little. Now, my mystery about that is, of course, I've spent a lot of time in New York, and for the longest time, cab drivers were white guys and some white women and so on. And that's evolved. And I've never figured out exactly why that's the case, because unless it's just the economics, but, but in general, I just don't see that as really being anyone's taking anyone's job.
Well, and I've heard the expression not as frequently as I did back then, but I still hear it from time to time. Often it's with, in fact, just maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I was at this social gathering, and there were some high school students who were just graduating high school and applying to college. And one of the young men said, well, I didn't get accepted because they probably prioritize some students of color over me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, really though? Like, it's an easy go-to still that folks of color have been getting privileges and special treatment, that it's become the system's become unfair. However, when I used to challenge people, I did not challenge that young man. He wasn't. I just overheard his conversation. I was like, right, but I would often say to people, well, if there were so many more advantages for folks of color to go to college and or over employment opportunities, why are the numbers so low in college? Why are the numbers so low in terms of percentages of employment for folks of color? In fact, it's, for African Americans, no matter what the unemployment rate is nationally, historically, African Americans have always had twice the level of unemployment, whether in good times or bad times economically. Their unemployment is twice the rate for white populations. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of other evidence of it not being, that there's still systemic challenges with racial equity, but yet the myths and the beliefs of people still hold on and come up.
Of course, we're dealing with, in this case, race and so on. Whereas if we really want to get to statistics, we could deal with persons with disabilities whose unemployment rate is something close to 20 times what it is for so-called able-bodied people. And it is just as much a prejudicial issue.
Right.
Because the reality is, it isn't that we can't do the work, it's that we're not given the opportunity to do the work.
Right. And do you know if within the disabilities population or the disabled populations, the intersectionality of race within that is that, like, if a disabled person is a disabled white person has a 20%, or how did you say it?
20 times as much. The unemployment rate typically is between 65 and 70%.
Yeah.
Is it different? Is it different based on race? Oh, there are definite differences.
Probably. I suspect there is, but I'm given that, I'm just curious.
But I think the overall number from census and Social Security Administration and others is that number. Is it different racially? I don't have the statistics, but I think I have heard that it is. So you're not going to find that. Look, I know blind people who are very prejudiced against people who are black. Yeah. And it's extremely unfortunate. We know that's a learned behavior.
Right.
Personally speaking, not having ever seen color, it doesn't matter to me a single solitary bit. But it is an issue that we encounter.
Yeah.
And we've got to get over that somehow. And the whole immigration thing is such a problem because we have allowed it to become political, which makes it even worse to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
How do we deal with the immigration thing? Do you have any thoughts?
Well, to me, the anti-immigrant views are one form of racism. In fact, there's a guy I know, and I'm totally blanking on his name right now. Oh, no, got it. Eric Ward. Eric Ward, who I think he's currently the executive director of, no, lost the name. I may come up with it later. Eric Ward had done research that showed how there was a symbiotic social relationship between the rise in anti-immigrant speech and media coverage leading to violence against African American people and other races.
Yeah,
and I think we saw that
other races
play
as
out,
well.
right? And we probably saw that play out. We all saw it play out more so during the racist and the racially biased and statements that the former person who's currently under indictments
he who shall not be named.
right, when he would say these things, there was an increase in hate crimes, people being accosted at gas stations and things. So I think of anti-immigrant sentiment being an extension of racist views, mindsets, and values. And so in order for us to address anti-immigrant mentalities and thinking, we have to address the root causes of racism. And I think within that, we have to look at how do we help individual people learn? How do we shape or restructure or reshape our organizational systems of our nonprofit organizations? That's where I've been spending so many of my years working in and thinking about how to use those spaces of organizational structure to undo racism. And then there's the systemic level that racial inequity is perpetuated from the policies and the systems that have excluded or set barriers for equal access. So in order to address it, it's sort of a three-pronged strategy, I believe.
Yeah,
and I would say also at a beginning place for the individual level is learning about racial bias, and there's a lot more research and writing. I'd say in the last 4 years, there's more books that are coming out than ever before. When I was young, that's partly why I didn't have any language to understand my world around me, right? But yet there's been so much more great work that's been done in this field, and more books coming out in the last 4 years than ever I've seen in my life that are giving lots.
What's unfortunate is that in some quarters people want to ban books. I mean, there's a lot of value in what To Kill a Mockingbird teaches, and similar books, and yet people want to get rid of those, and that is just crazy.
It is. The To Kill a Mockingbird one in particular, I'm a huge fan. Having been an English teacher, actually, not just because of that, but when I used to have to teach. To Kill a Mockingbird is a frequently taught book in like 8th or 9th grade, right? Mm-hmm. And every year I would teach it, and I swore, I don't know, I've probably read the book like 10 times, and every time I would read it, I would see a new insight into, oh my God, look what she was doing. Look what Harper Lee was raising with that story. So I'm a huge fan of it. And I think, though, to that point about book banning, I think that's partly how the power structure of the system, as we're going through these social changes with the emergence of more consciousness, more intentionality to eliminate racism. Thank God for the Black Lives Matter movement. Thank God for the Me Too movement, and all of these social reckonings that have been happening. I'd say really more so than in the last 6 years. I think that there's more of the white privilege mentality that is desperately wanting to hold on because they see it as a loss. They see it if we give those people of color the same thing, I'm going to lose something, right? So they are striking out at anything that they think is going to challenge the status quo or the system or their privilege. And so that's where I think in fact, I swear I just saw a post on social media about librarians getting harassed and called names from folks who are wanting them to ban books in their library so that kids are not exposed to these sorts of ideas.
I am a great fan of and collect old radio shows as a hobby.
Oh.
And I think that it is part of our history, and some of it from time to time reflects racism. But one of my favorite shows, and I'll explain why, is Amos and Andy, which of course is about two Black guys. And I've had an opportunity to interact with one of the foremost experts on Amos and Andy some time ago. And for me, my history with Amos and Andy is that long before I really understood a lot about old radio, I grew up watching Amos and Andy on television. Well, I didn't see the colors, but I didn't even know they were Black, and I didn't even understand all of that. Okay, so anyway, I learned later that it was taken off television because Black people objected to being portrayed that way. And I can appreciate that intellectually looking back on it. But I asked this expert from the whole issue of Amos and Andy, so when did they stop really referring to Amos and Andy as Black? And what she said was basically, it started out that way when Amos and Andy came to New York. They asked where all the dark people lived and so on. But by 1937, it wasn't even talked about. They were just there. They were characters. And yes, they had the voices they did, but there wasn't really a lot of reference to Black or white or anything else. And you could draw your own inferences, and I know a lot of people did, but it across the board as a radio program was extremely entertaining and came up with a lot of very good plots that people reacted to. In fact, on Saturdays during the matinees, people would, the theater people would cut off the film so that everybody could listen to Amos and Andy. And I appreciate the problems with the show from the standpoint of race, but at the same time, it was something that across the board was very entertaining to people. But now we see discussions of, well, we can't have that in our libraries. We should get rid of that. And that doesn't help either.
Right. Yeah. Well, and you're reminding me of, so one of the ways that racial bias has been perpetuated has been through media, right? In fact, there's much more research of late on this, looking back at movies and television shows. And I remember thinking about this a few years ago when my kids were young, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna look up those movies that I enjoyed as a kid, and I'll watch them with my kids. And so I watched them, and I was stunned at how many racial stereotypes they would portray in these movies. And I'm like, oh, heck, I can't share that. And but we just grew up with it, right? That's part of where our racial biases come from. The images, the stereotypes that were used throughout media, and similar within the nonprofit sector. Actually, I kind of think the nonprofit sector has perpetuated racial stereotypes as all folks of color are poor.
Right.
Because most of the time, I mean, this is the whole premise of fundraising for nonprofits, is they put pictures of the very small percentage that they're actually serving of the kids of color, or colleges and universities do this all the time. It's they find the few kids of color in their organization, and they put their pictures up there, and they tell the sad story. Oh, this poor child, he had all these disabilities or challenges and setbacks, and we turned their life around, and give to us so that we can keep doing that. But it's perpetuating a deficit-based story, right? And a stereotype in that entire industry. And I'm seeing there's actually, and I'm not remembering his name, but there's a guy, I think he does a TED Talk, but he's been developing this work around asset framing. And he talks about it as the media, as the news. He goes into journalism, I think, his angles about that, of how here's an example of the way the traditional story talks about communities of color from a very deficit-based, there's always problems, the crime or the blah, blah, blah. And then he illustrates how to change that. It doesn't mean that there aren't still needs within and disproportionality within communities of color, but there's a way to frame that is what he calls sort of his asset framing. So that's another area that's emerging more and more so these days that I think is helpful.
But I think the issue also has to be, in part, that we can't deny our history. What we should do is learn from it. So taking programs like Amos and Andy away and just denying that they existed doesn't help either.
Well, but it has to be brought forward as a learning opportunity.
Correct. Correct.
Right?
Absolutely.
Right? And in fact, Michael, I think, I still continue to be surprised at how little or we received in our high school or college history courses about the inclusion of people of color in history,
or any minority group.
Right. And like, in fact, there's a woman, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. She's written a number of books. One of them in particular is the Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. And I only just read this maybe a year or two ago, and it was mind-blowing. I had no idea. And I'm somewhat fairly informed by other things I've read about Native American, information and books and literature. But it's still eye-opening. There's such a rich history of within our diverse populations that has been excluded. Yeah.
And we shouldn't do that, but we do. We in our high school environment didn't discuss it.
Right.
I hope it's better than it was. I have not taken high school history lately, but I'm aware that there is so much that we didn't discuss and refuse to really look at the rich history that all of us, whether it's race, persons with disabilities, and recognizing all of the things that people have contributed. One of the most famous cardiac surgeons in the early 1900s was Jacob Balatin, who was blind. And there's so many others, and there are so many different people who have contributed to our country, and they're not all white men, and there's no reason that we should be excluding those other than some improperly placed attitude, shall we say.
Yeah. Well, and Michael, I'm wondering, I've got a question for you. What, a couple years ago, I felt like I was seeing more disabilities inclusion around the term when organizations and people were talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. They were adding another lever. Was it? I forget which letter it was.
Accessibility, A.
Was it A?
I think so.
And so it was being more included a couple years ago, but I'm not hearing so much about it being included these days.
Well, the problem with saying diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility doesn't deal with it. So that deals with part of the issue with for persons with disabilities, if you will. But the issue still comes down to social acceptance. And the issue still comes down to equals. And I realize that the term disability has an implication, but we have totally warped the concept, as far as I am concerned, of diversity. When you talk to people about diversity, they'll talk to you about race, gender, sexual orientation, social class, and so on. You don't hear discussions of disability, which is why inclusion has gotten to be part of it.
Yeah.
But then they want to add in accessibility. But again, that is a nebulous term. So accessibility is as relevant for Latino people or Black people as it is for a person with disabilities in that sense. And so we need to change our definition, if you will, of disability and include it directly in the discussion. Yeah. Or another way to put it is, if you're truly going to call yourself inclusive, then you have to be inclusive. You can't be partially inclusive. It either is or it isn't. And I tend to believe in the quantum orientation of the word. Either you're inclusive, which means you're going to involve disabilities as well, or you're not inclusive at all. You can't have it both ways.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think there continues to be a significant effort. There are places where it's getting better. New York announced about a month ago that, and it's not going to happen instantly, there's a lot to be done to make it happen. I forget, it's 2045 or 2050 or something, but they're going to make 95% of all the subway stations in New York City wheelchair accessible. And that's a major undertaking to do, given that a lot of those subway stations were not and are very difficult to make accessible. So that's a major commitment. On the other hand, are they going to hire blind architects to help make that happen? Because there are blind architects. Are they going to do other things? There's a lot to the process.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm not trying to leave out persons of race or whatever, or different races, as opposed to blind people, but we need to get back to really expecting and demanding equity and inclusion across the board.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
Well, you talk a lot about racial equity and inclusion and climate change. Tell me something about that, why you bring the two together.
Well, for me, for a couple of reasons, actually. But, for me, I think at this stage of my life, where I want to spend my efforts and energy is to address racism and climate change, because I think they're two root problems or roots to so many other issues that I like to think about getting upstream or to the root of an issue, so that if we can fix that, then so many other things will improve consequent to that. And for climate change, if we don't, as humans, address climate change and reverse it, the scientific predictions are so severe that, access to college education kind of won't matter, because the college might be underwater as the seas continue to rise. That's just one. I'm kind of being facetious about that, but not all
three.
And so, for me, part of the view is that if we don't reverse climate change, there are going to be so many other catastrophes, from hurricanes to forest fires, continued devastation, that it will wreak havoc on so many of our other people's lives and our systems, that some of the other issues kind of won't matter so much. Not that they aren't important. I'm just saying that people are going to be so strapped. We, as human beings around the world, we're facing more droughts, etc., when basic needs are not going to be met. So we need to, at the same time, address climate change. But how I connect these two and why they are connected is that racism at its root is about power. And I think the same sort of mindset or thinking that is the foundational beliefs or mindsets of racism are about power in the same way that has led us down these systems paths towards creation of climate change. Like the if we which are about a power exploitation, control. There's so many different factors and variables to it, but I see the two definitely interlinked. And even so, in addition to that, I guess I'd say there's plenty of other research that's been describing this, is that people of color historically have always had a disproportionate environmental impact from pollution, from where they live, where their housing is built upon waste sites, or air pollution quality. In the city of Seattle, there's one of the poorest neighborhoods where life expectancy is 9 years lower than if you just drive 20 minutes to the wealthier neighborhood where the families in that neighborhood are. And that's because of the air pollution. The air pollution is so severe in the poor neighborhood, which is mostly folks of color, that it's affecting their health in just a short distance away, right? So there's always been that disproportional environmental exposure, and our systems have not necessarily changed that. And that's where climate change is continuing to impact folks of color more so as a frontline impact. As climate change continues to increase, more folks of color, percentages of folks of color are going to be experiencing the impact sooner and more severely.
So what kinds of things are you doing to advance dealing with these issues?
Well, so with climate change, I have done some work here in Washington before. We formed, a few years ago, we formed a coalition, a BIPOC coalition called Front and Center. And we worked with other mainstream environmental organizations to propose legislation that was, we came up with a more racially equitable policy proposal. We tried to work on it legislatively at the time in Olympia here in Washington State. We didn't get it passed that legislatively, so then we organized a statewide ballot initiative, and it was close, but it still didn't pass. But those were some of the kinds of, and that coalition continues to work today. And so I'm involved in another environmental organization and that sort of thing. But most of my time has been because, like I say, I don't believe that. I believe that these two things are so intertwined that most of my time lately has been spent on anti-racism work that will also benefit and lead to systems change for climate issues.
Do you think that we need to somehow completely tear down the process that we're using and start over, or can we make progress with doing things the way we are to promote racial and other kinds of difference, equity, if you will, as well as dealing with climate change? Or maybe climate change can help lead us to the other.
So had you asked me this question maybe 4 years ago, I would be giving you a different answer. I think 4 years ago, I would have said, I don't have a lot of belief or hope in the existing system that it's going to be able to change enough in my lifetime. But what I'm seeing on a broad scale and talking to folks about, there is been finally what I never thought I would see in my lifetime is some social reckoning around race. And even some of the opinion polling is starting to shift folks on their understanding of climate change. In fact, it was maybe only just about 6 years ago, I attended a Chamber of Commerce conference. And one of the keynote speakers at this conference, it was mostly for-profit corporations, lobbyists, and different elected leaders across different levels of our regional and local governments. And the keynote speaker was saying how he said, it doesn't matter. His talk was about how even if you personally, as your business, does not believe that climate change is real, you're going to have to change your opinion because more people believe it's true, whether or not you think it is or not. But that was only 6 years ago, right? And then
Wow.
we had similarly, in the same way that we have anti-rhetoric constantly in our politics that's shaping public opinion, we have had an enormous amount of misinformation about climate change deniers, politicians claiming that it was a hoax from China or whatever. We've had so much of that influence, but even that has started to change. And some more of the folks who have claimed before at the federal level are finally seeing the impacts, like in Florida, how they cannot continue denying the impact of climate change that's happening right on their shores,
Yeah.
So there's some of that, but that's what I've seen starting to change in the last few years, and especially around race. There does seem to be a social reckoning, a desire from people wanting to change, to learn. Where is my own racial bias? There was that book that came out, and it's getting more and more broadly read, the book White Fragility. And I think it's really helping people see things that, like, oh yeah, we cannot continue down this road. Look what it's led us to. We have to change course. There was a part of your question I didn't answer, though. What was the question again?
Why is there air? I think the question basically was,
do we burn it all down?
Do we burn it all down and start over?
And that's where, I would have said 6 years ago, when I used to do more direct lobbying work or direct policy advocacy work, that there was such a lack of fundamental understanding about racial inequity. Like, I would talk to potential candidates who were running for elected office and do interviews with them and say, what's your view on racial equity, and what would you do if you got elected to advance it? And 9 times out of 10, they didn't know what I meant by racial equity. But these days, in the last several years, I'd say I'm starting to see much more understanding. The policies that are coming out of our legislature are, in fact, some of that advocacy and lobbying started to shift a little bit of when I was going in coalitions to talk to policymakers, and we'd say, okay, we like this, we want to support this issue, but we want it to include some aspects that will address the racial inequity in this issue. And they'd say, oh, okay, that sounds great, but what should it be? So then we would come up with their recommendations to make it more racially equitable. But that was a new thing. And now I'd say in the last 4 years, more and more elected folks are coming up with, talking to folks in the community, asking for their solutions so that they can make new policies and new improved systems to break down the barriers that have been in place that have perpetuated it. So these days, I'm much more optimistic that the system is finally moving in a way that is going to start undoing itself and improving. But secondly, I guess I've come to the belief, Michael, that our systems are so massive, our organizational structures are so entrenched that we would never be able to tear them all down, that we have to work within the structures that we are given. And that's where some of my work around anti-racism has been focusing on. There's this whole sector of nonprofit organizations and structures. So how do we work within the structure? Because some of those structures actually have some value. There were some aspects of structural things that were supposed to be in place to ensure that nonprofit organizations had some level of assurances or accountability that their missions were going to benefit the public, right? It was some sort of checks and balance. But how the organizations were implementing is where the perpetuation of racism has been occurring. So I'm still working within the system of nonprofit structures to shift the way that people think about how it shows up. What does racism and power show up within our existing structures, and how can we work within that to do things better or undo racism?
So I have a couple questions. Let me start with this one, which is kind of more general, and it just came to mind. We tend to, let's talk about climate change as an example. We tend to not want to pay attention to or deal with things that that don't affect us directly. Mm-hmm. And so climate change is a very existential thing. Mm-hmm. How do we, in our educational system, for example, start teaching people to be more curious and to look a little bit farther than just their own psyche? And I can think of answers to that question, and it depends on where in the country you live, because some people have beliefs that are so entrenched that there's just no discussing it. Yeah. And as you point out, there are places where there's a little bit more openness to it, but it still is an issue that we're going to have to deal with. And you talked about climate change. Look at what's going on in California with all of the fires, with the Colorado River now being where it is, and Lake Mead is 27% of where it normally is. And we're going to have to figure out these things. And I suppose some people can say, well, you can blame it on climate change, but it's natural. Well, it's not natural, right? In the scheme of what we need to do or can do to address it. So how do we get people to be more open and look beyond themselves a little bit?
The last part of that question for me is about undoing racism, because being an anti-racist is about caring about other people. Anti-racism is fundamentally about love. You know, when Dr. King talked about the beloved community, it's a creation of a caring community, and it's a recognition that my future is completely intertwined with your future, and that we have a mutual, inextricable interconnectedness in a shared positive future, right? That value, or that, it's almost like a value that we need to teach, right? But how you teach that is it's something I continue to experiment with in my work with nonprofits, right? Sometimes I draw from Dr. King's writing, but also Bell Hooks. One of her books called All About Love talks about love in an aspect of within society, within family, within organizations. But there's the other part of your question that is exactly what some researchers are grappling with, trying to figure out why is it that we as human beings, they say, you know, that they've recognized that because climate change is, you don't see it happen. I don't know how to say this very well. I'm not saying this very well. Climate change has been happening, but it's been happening over time and so slowly that sometimes it's been hard for people to recognize it, right, when it's happening. But it's accumulating so much, like you say, in California, that it's undeniable, right?
And it's speeding up.
And I just heard this, my wife, and I'm not going to remember the name of it, but she had me listen with her to a news program. I can't remember if it was an NPR program, and it was this, the story, was it Lake Mead? Was that the lake that completely dried up? There's a lake in California that did completely dry up a few years back.
Not Lake Mead, but there are some, so I'm not sure which one was in the program.
It was one that dried up a few years back already, completely. But what happened, he goes in, and I had never heard of this, right? I was like, oh my God, how did I never hear of this before? Because he talks about, the story he's starting with is how Salt Lake is drying up.
Right.
and the ramifications of if Salt Lake completely dries up, what a disaster it will be. It will be a
Sure.
disaster to the families who make a living, whose economy depends on it, not just the birds and the species, etc. But he also goes and says, he tells the story about this other lake in California that did dry up, and it caused so many other disasters, and the impact of it was so massive. The state of California had to spend like billions of dollars for the ramifications of that one lake drying up, and that was small compared to what Salt Lake is.
Well, and Lake Mead is fed by the Colorado River, which is why it is so low compared to where it normally is, because the water just isn't there.
Yes. Well, and that's part of what he said. Like, I thought this was fascinating in his story, where 70%, I think he said, of Salt Lake is from, the reason it's shrinking. The reason it's shrinking, 70% of the reason it's shrinking is because the rivers that feed Salt Lake is being diverted.
Right.
And it's being diverted for agricultural reasons, which is important. But that's, again, a systemic challenge, because we have had the technology to implement agriculturally to be more, to ensure that the water that we are using for irrigation systems will be more efficient and not wasted, but we haven't really implemented them.
Right. Tell me about the nonprofits that you work with, and you started one, I believe.
Oh, yeah. I've helped start a few of them, but the one that I talk most about and have learned so much from getting started a few years back is called the Latino Community Fund of Washington State. I started that when I was working in the foundation world, where there was some research that came out that pointed out how foundations, everybody assumes that, foundations give money to all these poor folks of color, right? Well, in reality, foundations were only giving 1.3% of their foundation grant dollars to Latino nonprofit organizations. All communities of color combined, it was only 8.6, which is significantly disproportionate to the size of the populations or the inequities in the systems. And so a few of us started up what's called Latino Community Fund of Washington State to try and see what we could do to move more resources to Latino programs and organizations here in the state.
So what are you doing today primarily?
I continue to support Latino Community Fund, but mostly as I've been working in different nonprofits, I've been serving as a interim executive director. Currently, I'm working for one called the Mockingbird Society, actually a reference to Harper Lee's book, To Kill a Mockingbird. And its mission is to eliminate youth homelessness and transform the foster system to one of caring. And doing that with a lens of racial disproportionality. And so what I've been doing within these kinds of organizations, and I do some consulting projects from time to time, working with boards, working with staff to work within the structure of the nonprofit organization to adopt an anti-racist practice, to move towards an anti-racist culture of the organization, that all people in the organization can be happy, healthy, and thrive, as well as how they deliver either program services in the community or how they engage and develop the community that they're working in. In fact, I just came out with an article that I co-authored. I think I just sent you the link to it. Now, if you can't access it, let me know, and I might be able to find some other way to share it with you. But a few months ago, let me back up the story a little bit, because it was where these notions have been coming from, and why I focus on this so much in my work is part of my story of, I think when I started working in foundations, I they were miserable places to work. But I also started a graduate school program, and in that program they had a series of courses on leadership. And I think at that time I had assumed that leadership meant the people at the top of the hierarchy, as commonly what that definition meant.
Right.
When in my leadership courses, I was doing, all this reading and a part of the program to realize, oh, leadership is actually a set of behaviors or actions that people do wherever you are within structures, whether it's society, whether it's in an organization, whether it's in a family or your neighborhood or wherever. So I remember thinking, oh, okay, well, maybe I'm a leader. Maybe does that mean I'm a leader? Right? And so over the years, then I started looking at like around me in the organizations that I was at, and especially when these organizational cultures were so toxic, so painful places to work. I was trying to figure out, well, why? They have this wonderful mission statement, or externally they are seen as having such a great purpose, but yet inside it was a toxic, horrible place to be, right? It was like the opposite of their own mission and stated values. So I've spent many years trying to figure out, like, what do we do about that? Again, back to your earlier question of, within this structure, how can we make it better? And that's where I use a lot of I draw from a lot of the previous work that others have done, especially around identifying characteristics of white supremacy culture. I think there's like 15 or 16 of those, and the work that they've done, folks prior to me learning about them have done to identify what are the antidotes to white supremacy culture. And that's where I think there is also a complete alignment of the antidotes to white supremacy culture with the effective leadership behaviors and practices. And so that's where I'm working on trying to empower more Latino leadership for folks to see themselves in that and to step into it, right? But to have some understanding of it based on the values that are also going to advance anti-racism. And that's where I've been working with a friend of mine, Tanya Hino Gonzalez, and we came out with a podcast series ourselves called Adelante Leadership. And we're interviewing a whole series of folks that are often unrecognized Latino community leaders, but having them share their wisdom, knowledge, and experience to inspire and encourage others. And similarly, earlier this year, a lot of this thinking and work I've done with friends and colleagues in the nonprofit space led me to put on a workshop at the Washington Nonprofit Conference called Applying Anti-Racist Leadership Across the Whole Organization. And that workshop led to me co-authoring a piece that just came out yesterday with a title very similar to that.
The reality is that if we really talk about leadership, and we look at leaders who are recognized because maybe they lead companies and so on, and they're the ultimate people in charge or the people who direct. The smart leaders are the ones who know when to give up leadership to other people in the organization, because those people have specific expertise or gifts that make them more able to strengthen part of the organization. And the wise leader is the one that knows how to, essentially what I'm saying is, create a team where everybody can contribute and feel like that they can contribute.
And that example is one of the antidotes to white supremacy culture.
Sure it is.
That's about sharing power. The example you're citing to me sounds like sharing power. And that's where, but not all, but right, the people who are the CEO of an organization, if they don't have sort of an awareness about power, because they will never even be consciously or intentional to share it, because that's
correct.
In the same way that racism is the default, so is hoarding power is the default.
Sure,
Right?
it is. And it makes you and the organization a whole lot less effective when, to use your terms, you hoard power
Yeah.
rather than recognizing the gifts that everyone has. And you talk about love and joy and healing as being part of what one needs to do to deal with improving equity across the board. And the good leader is joyous in finding other people who can add value to what they do. And for me, I've led organizations, and one of the things that I say to most people, and other people on this podcast have heard me say it before, is my job isn't to tell you what to do. My job is to add value to enhance what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I will figure that out together.
Right. Absolutely.
And that's what we really need to do, is find more ways to work together. And we've got to make it a volitional process, or we're going to be in a real world of hurt, and it's going to become worse as time goes by, whether it's with climate change, racial, or attitudinal toward persons with disabilities, or whatever the case happens to be.
Absolutely. Right. And that's where, for me, I think fundamentally you're reminding me, Michael, it's like why this is important. These issues are important to me is because at least if we can make some progress, it will reduce the pain and the harm and the hurt, so that maybe more people will have opportunities to experience more happiness and joy. That everybody should. That should be fundamental, right?
It should be. And we've got to get over thinking that we're better because they're different than us.
Yes.
So much. Well, Peter, tell me, how can people reach out to you, maybe learn more about you, or find ways to work with you, and so on?
Oh, gosh. Well, so I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn, Peter Bloch Garcia, Bloch. Oftentimes, because it's pronounced Bloch, but it's spelled with a CH instead. People often mix that up.
Yes.
But I'm always responding to people that reach out to me on LinkedIn or Facebook. They can find out more about the work I'm doing with my friend Tanya on Adelante Leadership. It's adelanteleadership.com. They can find our
spell that? Could you spell that?
Oh, geez, I have to write it out.
It's a test.
It is. It is. It's like, right. Actually, because it's.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah. ADELANTE, and then leadership. It's all together as one word.
Right.
Adelante means to kind of push forward, to go forward. It's got sort of a sentiment in Spanish that's an encouragement to advance. And we're kind of combining it in trying to do some of these interviews both in English and in Spanish, so that it's a bilingual podcast. But it's Adelante Leadership as one word.com.
And you were sort of going to say something about the podcast. How people can listen to it.
Oh, right. Yeah. And the podcasts are also available wherever podcasts, like on Spotify or Apple, whatever platforms that people access podcasts, they can find Adelante Leadership on.
If people feel that they might be able to contribute to it, how can they explore being guests?
They can email us at, I think there's a mechanism on the website, but also other people have reached out to me through LinkedIn or Facebook. They have emailed me that way too. I think we have a Facebook or LinkedIn Adelante page. No, I know we have an Adelante LinkedIn page. Maybe that's where I've had some people reach out. In fact, I'm talking to this one young woman. She's I don't know how old she is. Dang, she's a smart, young Latina, like PhD, etc. And she just came across us on the internet, on social media, and emailed us.
cool.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to continue this in the future. I'm sure there's going to be more that we can talk about. So I hope that we get you to come back on. Maybe you and Tanya both ought to come back on at some point, because I'd love to continue this discussion. It's been fascinating, and I've learned a lot, and I hope others have as well. So I'm really glad that you were able to be here. And all of you listening, wherever you are, please reach out to Peter and learn more about adelanteleadership.com and learn more about the efforts that are going on, and help all of us get rid of these prejudices around difference, because it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with race or disabilities or any topic that identifies somebody as different than somebody else. We've got to get rid of it. We've got to start recognizing we're all on the same planet and we need to work together. So Peter, thank you. But also, again, all of you, thank you. If you'd like to comment on today's podcast, please do so. You can email me at michaelhi@accessibe.com, or go to the podcast page, Michael Hingson, HINGSON.com/podcast, or again, wherever you find this podcast. And as Peter said, wherever you can find podcasts. And I would ask that you give us a 5-star rating. Please say positive things and give us a great rating. We appreciate it. Your comments and your thoughts are what help us. If you know of anyone else who should be a guest on our podcast, please let us know, and we would be glad to talk with you and them about that. So once again, Peter, thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.